Alright, so now we're going to look at different ways that our body regulates hydrogen ion concentration. And again, this is going to help us keep a normal pH level. So we've got acid-base buffer systems. These are three different systems that are chemicals in our blood that are going to keep our blood pH in a normal range. We'll look later at why that's so important. So before we get into that, I want you to write down a few notes. So if you want to pause this real quick and just write this down, I'll give you a quick second to do that, and then I'll explain that for you. So just hit pause and write these down. All right, so the first chemical up top, HCO3, and it's a negative charge. That's what that negative stands for. This is bicarbonate ion. This acts as a base inside of our blood, and in a little bit we'll see why that's important. It helps regulate our blood pH. All right, carbonic acid is a weak acid, so it's not going to release a lot of hydrogen ions, so it's a weak acid. All right. Down at the bottom, we've got monohydrogen phosphate ion. So that's a hydrogen, potassium, oxygen with actually 4 oxygens, and it has a charge of -2. And then we have dihydrogen phosphate ion. So that's 2 hydrogens and then that phosphate group, and it has a charge of -1. All right, so that was a lot. I know that's just kind of notes to write down, but let's look at why that's important on this next slide. Okay, so these are the different buffer systems that we have. Remember, a buffer is a chemical that's going to keep blood pH stable. First one is the bicarbonate system. So inside your blood, just floating around, you have these bicarbonate ions. Okay, and their job is that they help convert a strong acid into a weak acid. We talked about that at the end of the last part of the lecture. But what this is saying is if there's a strong acid in your blood and it's bringing our pH down too low, one of the things we can do to help that is to turn the strong acid into a weak acid, and that's actually going to help raise the pH to get it closer to where it should be. All right, so this is what this means. This HCO3 is bicarbonate, and it says it converts a strong acid into a weak acid. So if you've got a strong acid that's in your blood, it's going to be releasing a bunch of these hydrogen ions. So the first, get my cursor, first little H right here, these hydrogen ions. All right, so those are in your blood, and they are actively making your pH too low, making it too acidic. So the hydrogen, the positive charge of the hydrogen will combine with the negative charge of the bicarbonate ion, and what it does is it basically grabs onto it. It captures that hydrogen ion and it converts it into carbonic acid. So this H2CO3 is carbonic acid. So what we've done is we've taken a strong acid that's already released its hydrogen, that is making your blood pH go down too low, and we've turned it into a carbonic acid. Now that's a weak acid, so that's actually better for us. Okay, so that's one of the ways that we can regulate our blood pH. If it's too low, we can grab some of those hydrogen ions and convert them into a weaker carbonic acid. We can also do the opposite. So it says carbonic acid can convert a strong base into a weak base. So let's say we've got strong bases inside of our body and our pH is getting too high now. It's got to stay at a really normal range. Your blood pH should be 7.4. That's the normal healthy range for your blood pH. So let's say it's getting too high. There's too many bases in there. These carbonic acids that are floating around in your blood, they can just do the opposite now. If the pH gets too high, they can break apart and release hydrogen ions. So that's going to make it more acidic. And if the pH was too high, then adding an acid is actually going to bring it back down lower to where it should be. All right. I know this is one of the tougher things to follow on this lecture. So when we meet back on Monday, I've got a quick activity for us to do to kind of give an example of this. So study it and read in the book, but if you're not completely getting it right now, don't panic. All right. So this on the bottom, the really long formula right here, this is just showing how both of those fit together. So if we release too much hydrogen ion, your blood pH is getting too low, too acidic. The bicarbonate ion can grab onto the hydrogen and turn it into carbonic acid. That's going to help bump our pH up to the normal range. Now let's say later on it's getting too high, it's getting too basic. So what we can do is we can take this carbonic acid, it can break apart and release the hydrogen ions, and that's going to bring it back down to where it should be. So it can act either way depending on the situation. If pH is too high or too low, we can fix that. We can adjust it. So that's what a buffer does. All right. All right. You need to know these formulas. So that one right there that we just went through, you need to be able to know this formula and actually write it out, and you need to be able to explain what that is. That would be a really good short answer question, is to write down the formula for the bicarbonate system and to explain how it regulates pH inside the body. All right. If you're watching this lecture, if you've actually watched part 4, that's your reward, as I'm letting you know what one of the short answer questions are. All right. The phosphate system, it really does the exact same thing. We just use different chemicals. So monohydrogen phosphate converts a strong acid into a weak acid. Just like bicarbonate, if we've got too much hydrogen ions, monohydrogen phosphate can grab onto that hydrogen ion and it converts it into a weaker acid. All right. And then dihydrogen phosphate converts a strong base into a weak base. That's the thing we made right here. This was dihydrogen phosphate. So if we're getting too basic, if the blood pH is getting too high, we can break this apart, release the hydrogen ion, and when we do that, that's going to bring it back down to where it should be. So same thing for this formula. It's just saying that if we have too much, if it's too acidic, we've got too many hydrogen ions, we can absorb those and form dihydrogen phosphate, which is going to bring the pH up. But if the pH gets too high, we can break down dihydrogen phosphate and release the hydrogen ion, and that's going to bring it back down to where it should be. Okay, last one is called the protein buffer system. So proteins are always going to have two components that are found inside of a protein. We know that proteins are made up of amino acids. So that's the building blocks that make up proteins. Each amino acid is going to contain an ammonia group and it's going to contain a carboxyl group. All right. So it says the ammonia group releases a hydrogen ion in the presence of excess base. So if there's too much base, we've got proteins that are floating around inside our blood. If the pH of our blood is getting too basic, it's getting too high, then ammonia can break apart and release a hydrogen. All right, so that's going to help it get back to where it should be. It's going to lower it. Carboxylic acid, it accepts a hydrogen ion in the presence of excess acid. So the opposite is true too. If our blood pH is getting a little too low, too acidic, and we've got too much of this hydrogen ion that's floating around, then this carboxylic acid can grab onto it and it can convert it, it can absorb it, and that's going to help bring the pH back up to where it should be. All right, again, I know this one was tricky, so some of this I'm just going to assume that you've watched the lecture and that's it, but we will talk about this a little bit on Monday just to make sure we're all clear on that. All right, so those are our acid-base buffer systems. The other ones in comparison to this are much easier. So let's look at that. Respiratory excretion of carbon dioxide. So let's look at the chart on the right first. So this is how we can get rid of carbon dioxide if we have too much. So what happens, it says the cells increase their production of carbon dioxide. So you could be exercising, you're active, you're doing something like that, but your body is going to be making more carbon dioxide inside the cells. So we've got to get rid of that carbon dioxide. That's what we talked about in the respiratory system. So carbon dioxide can react with water in the blood to form carbonic acid. And that's an acid. It's going to make our blood pH go down too low. So carbonic acid will break down and it will actually release that hydrogen ion. That's going to make our blood pH go down too low. So when that happens, that's going to stimulate the respiratory system in our brainstem. All right. The respiratory system, this was one of your short answers on the last test. The respiratory system, or the respiratory centers in your brainstem, that was the pontine and the medullary systems that we talked about. They control how fast we breathe and how deep our breaths are. So blood pH gets too low because we've got too much carbon dioxide. That's going to tell our respiratory center to cause breathing to happen faster and deeper. So the rate and depth of breathing increases. We're going to get rid of carbon dioxide faster. And as we remove carbon dioxide, that's going to prevent the buildup of carbonic acid. And that's going to help the pH go back up to where it should be. So kind of side notes over on the left right here. The brainstem, we're talking about the respiratory centers, the medullary and pontine centers, and those regulate the rate and depth of breathing. And then it just says the opposite is also true. So if you're not very active, if you're just kind of laying around and you're not doing that much, your body is not going to be making as much carbon dioxide, and that means that the hydrogen ions are going to remain pretty low. So when your carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions and your blood pH are in a normal range, then that means that your rate and depth of breathing are going to decrease. Okay? And just think that should make sense too. If you're outside, you're doing something active, you're going to be breathing faster to get rid of that extra carbon dioxide. If you're just laying around, or when you're sleeping, for example, you're not breathing really fast because you're not making as much carbon dioxide because you're less active. All right, next up is renal excretion of hydrogen ions. All right, so this slide and the last one, if you'll notice, there's not many notes that are pointed out. It just has this chart. So know this chart. You're not going to have to fill one out like from scratch or anything or draw it, but you do need to know this information. Now this one's actually pretty straightforward. So one of the ways that we can have hydrogen ions in our blood is when we break down proteins, it releases hydrogen ions. We mentioned that a couple slides ago when we were talking about where the hydrogen comes from. When we break down certain amino acids, that causes sulfuric acid, which can give hydrogen ions in our blood. So if we take in too much protein in our diet, when we break down the amino acids, increased metabolism of amino acids is going to cause an increased formation of sulfuric acid and phosphoric acid. So by breaking down and digesting proteins, we're adding acid to our blood. This increases the concentration of hydrogen ions in all of our body fluids. So our body fluids are getting too acidic. This causes an increase in the secretion of hydrogen ion fluids into the fluids of the renal tubules. So we've got too many hydrogen ions in our fluid, we're going to dump more out when we're producing urine. So by doing this, it says that we have an increased concentration of hydrogen ions in our urine. So it's basically, this one is don't overthink it. You take in more proteins, that's going to give you more hydrogen ions, so you get rid of more hydrogen ions when you urinate. And when we do that, the concentration of hydrogen ions in body fluid returns towards normal. So we go back down to where it should be. All right, so that is our summary of the acid-base balances. So it says our first line of defense against pH shift. pH shift means that our pH is getting out of that normal range. So it should be 7.4, but when it starts to shift too high or too low, first line of defense is we have chemical buffers, so bicarbonate ions and phosphate buffer systems and protein buffer systems. All of those are going to help move it back to where it should be. If that doesn't work though, if the change is too great, we have a second line of defense, which are the physiological barriers or buffers. These are things that we can do with our body. So we can increase respiration, or we can increase hydrogen excretion in our urine. Okay? All right, so we're like at 13.5 minutes right now. We've got a couple more notes, some clinical applications we're going to look at, and we'll be done. But I'm going to go ahead and pause it right now, and we'll finish up with part 5.